The silence before the storm, the tall glass tower of Alphabet Inc., shimmered in the morning sunlight like a sentinel of modern ambition. Inside, it buzzed quietly with the early activity of the world's top tech minds. Among them, moving without fanfare, was a man in a simple gray blazer, his steps unhurried, yet full of intense Sundar Pichai to most. Sundar was the face of calm in the storm, a CEO known more for measured responses than for explosive speeches. But what most didn't know was that beneath that still surface flowed a river of lived experiences, shaped by fire, humility, and a keen sense of justice. What was about to unfold in the coming months would test not his intellect, but his silence. Humble origin before he led Google and Alphabet. Before the boardrooms and stock prices, there was a boy named Sundar in Chennai, India. He shared a cramped two-room apartment with his parents and younger brother. They didn't own a car nor a phone. His father, an electrical engineer, brought home stories of transistors and circuits. His mother, a stenographer, filled the house with discipline and warmth. Sundar was curious but quiet. His teachers often mistook his silence for uncertainty, but his classmates knew better. In one class project, when given a faulty science kit, he used salvaged scrap metal and wires to build a working radio. The project didn't win a prize, but it won something better: respect. The silence he carried wasn't empty. It was watchful, absorbing, calculating. While others rushed to speak, Sundar listened. A life between worlds by the time Sundar landed in the United States for graduate studies at Stanford. He was carrying a duffel bag of clothes, a few books, and a dream far too big for any suitcase. Culture shocked him. The noise, the pace, the assumption that everyone deserved the best dot at Stanford. He lived modestly, cycling miles to attend classes, skipping expensive meals, and staying up late at the library. But his brilliance soon stood out. He had an almost mystical ability to see systems, how technology, people, and policies interacted, and how a single change could alter everything. It wasn't long before Google came knocking. The rise Sundar's journey through Google was meteoric. From working on the Google toolbar to launching Chrome, his ability to simplify complexity made him indispensable. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was always the one people listened to when the noise died down. By 2015, he became the CEO of Google and later Alphabet. But with power came storms. The quiet before the quake. It began subtly. A female employee named Angela Ruiz, a senior engineer from Puerto Rico, requested a private meeting with Sundar. She looked nervous as she sat across from him in the sleek executive conference room. Sundar offered his usual quiet gesture to disarm tension. Angela, voice trembling, revealed that she'd been repeatedly overlooked for promotions despite exceeding every performance benchmark. Worse, she suspected internal sabotage from a senior executive who had, in her words, repeatedly belittled her origins and ideas. Sundar's eyes didn't widen. He didn't gasp. He simply listened. He asked questions calmly. He asked for proof, for documentation, not because he didn't believe her, but because he knew the machine they were up against was large and well-oiled. She left, unsure if anything would come of it. The email that wasn't meant to be seen too. Weeks later, Sundar received an anonymous email. It contained screenshots from internal chats among a small clique of senior managers. The tone was dismissive, elitist, and at times cruel. She should be grateful she's even here. Sundar's too soft. He won't do anything. She's just playing the diversity card. It was shocking. Not just because of the content, but because one of the names on the thread was someone Sundar had mentored himself. That night, Sundar didn't sleep. He went back to his roots, the apartment in Chennai where his mother once told him, "You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Make your silence so loud that it shakes them." the injustice rather than react impulsively, Sundar started observing. Over the following weeks, he initiated quiet audits. He didn't announce them. He brought in external ethics officers without fanfare. He reviewed promotion data across departments. Patterns emerged. Voices were being muted. Ideas stolen. Talent ignored. The media, always alert, began sensing something brewing. Rumors of a potential scandal began circulating. But Sundar didn't hold a press conference. He didn't fire anyone publicly. He just waited. And then he acted. The meeting that changed everything. Sundar scheduled an all-executive leadership meeting, mandatory, confidential, and off-site. They thought it was another strategy summit. But the room they walked into wasn't a stage. It was a mirror. A projector displayed every problematic conversation, every ignored performance review, every biased evaluation. Names were redacted, but everyone recognized the behavior. Some executives looked away. Some shuffled uncomfortably. Then Sundar stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "This company was built on ideas. Not on egos, not on privilege, and certainly not on prejudice. We lead billions of users. But if we cannot lead with justice, we do not deserve to lead at all." Double quotes, silence. And then he added, "I have made decisions. You will find them in your inbox." Within seconds, the worst offenders had been demoted or placed under review. Others found their promotions revoked. And a new ethics and equity office was formed, reporting directly to Sundar. Angela Ruiz. She received a personal note from Sundar himself. They underestimated silence. But silence heard everything. A shift in the wind. The media praised Sundar's stealth ethics revolution. Internally, some resented it. But others, especially the quiet, overlooked ones, found new courage. More voices began to rise. And Sundar? He stayed as silent as ever until he needed to speak. Because now, everyone listened. The weight of silence. When justice becomes personal. The winds had shifted, but the air inside Google's core offices remained deceptively still. After the executive meeting that left several senior figures stunned and others quietly grateful, a hushed reverence followed Sundar Pichai wherever he walked. Not because he had shouted, not because he had threatened, but because he had made something undeniable clear: that real power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it watches. And when it moves, it does so with a clarity so precise, it cuts through noise like a razor through silk. But what Sundar didn't expect in the aftermath of his silent crusade against injustice was how deeply personal this battle would become. 3 weeks after the reorganization and formation of the Ethics and Equity Office, Sundar received a letter. Not an email, not a Slack message. A handwritten envelope placed quietly on his assistant's desk, with no return address, just his name in delicate cursive. As he opened it in the stillness of his office, the scent of old paper struck him faintly. Floral, strangely familiar. The letter read like something torn from the past. "Dear Sundar, you may not remember me. Or perhaps you do. In 1995, at Stanford, you watched me cry in the hallway outside the computer science department. You asked if I was okay. I said I was. You nodded. You didn't press me. You just handed me your notebook and said, 'If you ever need help, I have notes.' I was never able to say thank you. But what you did last week reminded me of that day. Sometimes silence speaks, and sometimes it saves lives. Meena K." He stared at the note for several minutes, trying to remember the face behind the name. Meena, of course. A shy, brilliant mind from Mumbai, always in the back row, always scribbling faster than the lecturer could speak. She had disappeared after the first semester without explanation. And now, decades later, her words arrived like a breeze from a long-forgotten season. But what haunted Sundar wasn't the flattery. It was what she said at the end. Sometimes silence saves lives. That phrase stayed with him like an echo inside a cathedral. And not long after, life would force him to understand exactly what that meant. It started with a phone call, one he wasn't expecting. Not from another CEO or a board member or an investor, but from his mother in Chennai. She rarely called during work hours unless it was something urgent. Her voice was composed, but Sundar, now more attuned to silence than ever, could detect the undercurrent of worry. Sundar, beta, your cousin Arvind is in trouble. Arvind was the younger son of his father's late brother, someone Sundar had last seen over a decade ago at a family wedding. Arvind had grown up in rural Tamil Nadu, faced hardships but fought hard to become an engineer. He had recently taken a job with a major tech subcontractor based in Bangalore that provided services to companies like Google. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Or at least it was until now. Arvind, it turned out, had become the whistleblower in a massive internal corruption case within the contracting firm. He had discovered that certain supervisors were manipulating software testing results, charging client companies for services never rendered. When he raised concerns, he was first ignored, then threatened, and eventually, he was terminated under the pretext of behavioral misconduct. But that wasn't all. And yet, amid the pushback, something extraordinary happened. Stories began to surface. A Syrian refugee employed at a European coding firm, one of Google's vendors, shared anonymously how she'd finally received equal pay after raising a concern through the new confidential portal. A transgender engineer in Latin America wrote an internal thank you message after being promoted fairly for the first time in 5 years. A blind programmer in Singapore reported how her accessible tools request, once ignored, had now been fully approved. These stories never reached the front page. They reached Sundar's desk. He read each one personally, not because he wanted applause, but because each one reminded him why he had stayed silent when it was easier to shout. Why he had waited until the truth could speak louder than any statement. Then came the test he never saw coming. A senior VP, one of the highest-ranking black women in the company, Ariana Freeman, filed an internal complaint. She had been subtly but persistently undermined by a peer over a 3-year period. When she raised it informally, she was gaslit. When she documented it, she was accused of being difficult. The worst part? The peer in question was a rising star, hailed by many as the next big tech visionary, someone already being considered for future CEO positions. Ariana came to Sundar's office. She didn't weep. She didn't ask for favors. She brought evidence, emails, performance reviews, notes from staff. She said, calmly, I'm not asking for you to believe me because I'm a woman or because I'm black. I'm asking you to look at the data. If that doesn't move you, nothing will. He didn't interrupt her once. When she left, Sundar sat in his chair, staring at her carefully organized file. It wasn't just a matter of misconduct. It was about culture, about whether truth was welcomed only when it was convenient or even when it was damning. The next day, Sundar summoned a special review panel. It included Layla, outside observers, HR, and 2 neutral senior engineers. He presented Ariana's case. He didn't editorialize. He just said, we've created a system to defend the overlooked. Now, let's see if we actually honor it when it gets uncomfortable. The investigation took 2 weeks. The outcome was as undeniable as it was messy. The rising star VP was removed from his post. Shockwaves hit the company like a wave. Supporters of the VP cried foul. Anonymous tweets alleged overcorrection. Pundits speculated whether Sundar had bent to woke pressure. Still, he said nothing publicly. But internally, he sent one brief company-wide message. Integrity is not a marketing strategy. It's a decision one we make every day, especially when it costs us. That one sentence became a poster in several offices. Not because it was catchy, but because it felt rare. Investors grew quieter over the next quarter. The projected dip began to flatten. And quietly, without much notice, Google began to see something more valuable than stock rebounds. Talent retention improved. Vendor loyalty increased. Surveys showed a spike in employee trust. But for Sundar, the most profound moment came not from a chart or a dashboard, but from a single line in a notebook, handed to him one afternoon by a young intern. She had been following the company's ethics journey closely and had written an essay titled The Math of Morals. At the end, she quoted a line from Sundar's earlier speech. "You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Make your silence so loud that it shakes them." She then wrote underneath it, "You didn't just shake them, Mr. Pichai. You steadied the rest of us." Sundar closed the notebook slowly, his throat tightening for just a moment. Not from pride, from purpose. That he understood now. Silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the refusal to be dragged into distraction. The strength to withstand storms without echoing their thunder. But above all, it was a commitment to lead not with ego, but with example. And in this world, that came with a price. But it was one he'd pay again and again. The echo of the unspoken. When the world begins to listen, there are moments in a leader's life when the world doesn't applaud immediately, but instead leans in, listening not for words, but for intention. That was the silence Sundar Pichai had stepped into. He had chosen principle over popularity, character over compliance. But what he didn't anticipate was how far his quiet revolution would ripple. By the time the fiscal year closed, the changes Sundar had introduced, subtle, often unannounced, and without media fanfare, had become something larger than a corporate policy shift. They had become a mirror, not only within Google's walls, but across an industry accustomed to comfort, dominance, and unchecked power. It began innocuously. A small media tech firm based in Nairobi posted a blog titled, "How Google's Ethics Protocol Helped Save My Startup." The article didn't trend, nor was it shared by influencers, but it found its way into the inbox of a product engineer in Zurich, a policy director in Argentina, and a human rights advocate in Jakarta. Each of them read the story, eyes pausing not on profit margins or technical features, but on one key paragraph: how a low-level whistleblower had, through Google's confidential platform, reported discrimination at the Nairobi firm's partner office and received help. Real help, legal resources, relocation support, mentorship, and more importantly, acknowledgement. The firm was small, but the impact was seismic for those who'd never been seen before. By the end of the month, similar stories surfaced quietly. Modestly, a disabled coder in Istanbul, a gay content editor in Poland, a Syrian refugee analyst in Germany. None of these voices made headlines, but they were being heard in the one place where power once never listened, in the halls of global tech. The Ethics and Equity Office, initially a modest division tucked inside Google's organizational matrix, now found itself at the epicenter of something unexpected. A movement of conscience wrapped inside corporate machinery. Sundar, for his part, didn't chase the wave. He remained anchored. Each week, he still met junior developers, read letters from employees in far corners of the globe, and held quiet conversations with engineers too nervous to speak aloud. His routine hadn't changed, but his presence had. People began to see him not as a distant figurehead, but as someone whose silence didn't mean absence, it meant presence without performance. And then came a moment that tested every fiber of that presence. It happened during a high-level tech diplomacy conference in Geneva, where leaders from major platforms, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, and others, had gathered to discuss ethical AI development. The conversations were predictably polished. Words like transparency, diversity, and accountability floated through the panels like well-rehearsed poetry. But it wasn't until the second day that things took an unplanned turn. A young African roboticist from Ghana named Kwame Mensah was invited as a keynote guest, a rare platform for a non-corporate voice. He spoke passionately about how AI tools, when trained with Western-centric data, were failing in critical African languages, thereby excluding millions from access. His speech was intelligent, heartfelt, and damning. When he finished, the room was silent, polite, and then an executive from a major tech firm made a snide remark not on the argument, but on the accent. "Interesting," he said, smirking. "But perhaps when the presentation is more linguistically polished, we'll understand the real message." The words hung like acid in the air. Kime froze. Some attendees laughed softly. Others looked away, unsure how to react. The moderator tried to deflect, moving quickly to the next item on the agenda. But Sundar didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, but his gaze fixed sharply on the speaker. During the post-panel networking hour, Sundar did something he rarely did. He walked away from the circle of dignitaries and made his way directly to Kwame. Cameras were watching. People took notice. He extended his hand and said, firmly but calmly, "I understood every word you said, Kwame, and so did the people who needed to." Then, without addressing the media, he simply turned to the organizers and requested that the full video of Kwame's speech be featured prominently on the conference's official page, along with translations and audio captions in multiple African dialects. The organizers, clearly flustered, agreed. By nightfall, a clip of Sundar's silent intervention, just a handshake and one powerful sentence, had gone viral. Not because it was flashy, but because it was rare. In a world obsessed with performative outrage, here was a man who had no need to yell. His silence had already spoken volumes. Back at Google headquarters, engineers began creating a language support toolkit inspired by Kwame's presentation. Within 2 weeks, 14 African dialects previously excluded from Google's voice assistant training sets were included in a new beta development. Sundar didn't post about it. He didn't tweet. But the results spoke loudly across communities who had always felt technologically invisible. Meanwhile, inside Google, something more delicate was unfolding. The real kicker was this: one of the client accounts affected by the fraudulent testing. Google. As Sundar processed the details his mother was relaying, something inside him tightened, not out of fear for Google's image, but out of something far deeper. Here was a young man, from his own family, raised in a similar soil of struggle and dreams, doing the right thing and paying the price for it. Sundar thanked his mother and promised to look into it. But he didn't rush. He didn't email the legal team. Instead, he sat at his window that evening, the San Francisco skyline glowing faintly in the dusk, and thought deeply. There was a larger pattern unfolding here, one that stretched from boardrooms in Silicon Valley to dusty tech centers in India. Injustice wasn't just a local weed, it was a global root system. And now, it had crossed a line that connected his personal and professional worlds. He called a meeting with a quiet, efficient woman named Layla, who headed the newly formed Ethics and Equity Office. She was a former UN human rights investigator, with a background in tech ethics, someone who understood both the nuance of systems and the sharp teeth of injustice. He laid out Arvind's story. Layla listened intently, taking notes, nodding, never interrupting. At the end, she said something unexpected. "Do you want to go public with this, Sundar?" He looked at her, puzzled. "You mean, issue a statement?" "No," she said. "I mean, do you want to become part of the story? Most CEOs would bury this, handle it internally. But you could make this an example. One that says no matter where injustice occurs, in your backyard or in a partner company, It matters. Sundar didn't answer immediately. But he didn't say no, either. Over the next few days, he initiated a private internal investigation into the Bangalore subcontractor. He didn't use his title. He didn't make calls to intimidate anyone. He just quietly traced the data, interviewed engineers through Layla's team, and built a picture of what had happened. It was worse than expected. Dozens of employees had been silenced. A few had even accepted hush money, and the company leadership was complicit. But here's where things took a sharp turn. The senior VP at Google, overseeing the contractor relationship, advised Sundar to avoid over-involvement. "This isn't our mess directly," the VP said. "We distance ourselves, issue a standard compliance notice, and move on." Sundar didn't raise his voice, but he stared at the VP with such focused stillness that the man shifted in his chair. "You know what happens," Sundar finally said, "when silence is used as a shield instead of a sword." The VP said nothing. It turns into complicity. And just like that, Sundar made a choice. He flew to Bangalore quietly with a minimal team. No press, no media, no public relations campaign. Just him, Layla, and two silent observers from the ethics division. They walked into the subcontractor's office unannounced. The receptionist didn't recognize him at first, until murmurs began to ripple through the office. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, was in the building. The management scrambled. Apologies were offered. Explanations rehearsed, but Sundar didn't ask for them. He went straight to the engineering bay, where Arvind used to sit, and asked to see the team. One by one, engineers emerged, cautious, nervous. They had seen corruption. They had felt threatened. But no one had ever come for them, until now. Sundar stood before them and spoke, not in corporate jargon, but from the marrow of his experience. "I grew up not far from here," he said, "in a house that didn't have a phone, where my father rode a scooter to work. I became who I am today because people gave me a chance to be heard. And I'm here because it's unacceptable for the voiceless to be buried while the powerful write the story." He then looked at the contractor's CEO, who stood at the back, pale and tight-lipped. "Today, we reset the story. From the inside out." That day, the entire upper management of the subcontractor was suspended pending investigation. Google terminated their contract within 72 hours and publicly pledged to review all vendor relationships with new transparency measures. But Sundar didn't stop there. He created a program named Silence as Strength, a confidential platform that enabled employees and contractors globally to report misconduct, with full legal support and protection. It was rolled out across all Google-partnered entities. No fanfare, no social media campaigns, just a quiet firewall against the next injustice. And Arvind? He didn't just get his job back. He was promoted to the Global Ethical Systems Auditing Team under Layla, where his story would fuel policy. Back in California, as Sundar returned to his office late one evening, a junior staffer riding the elevator with him asked a question. She looked too shy to be bold, but she asked anyway. "Sir, do you ever wish you were more vocal, like other CEOs?" Sundar smiled faintly. "I used to wonder that," he said. "But sometimes the loudest changes begin in silence." The elevator opened. He stepped out and walked down the hallway lined with glass and innovation, but for the first time in a long while, that hallway also echoed something else. Respect. Not the kind you demand. The kind you earn in silence. The price of integrity, when doing right costs more than money. After the bold dismantling of corruption within the Bangalore subcontractor, word spread like wildfire, not through the press, but internally, across Google's vast web of employees, vendors, and partners. It wasn't a public statement that made headlines. It was something more intimate. Engineers whispered about it in campus cafes. Junior analysts shared the story on encrypted threads, and middle managers discussed it in closed-door Zoom calls. The quiet man at the helm of the world's most influential tech empire had chosen justice over comfort, family over formality, ethics over expediency. And yet, in the corridors of corporate power, such decisions rarely came without consequences. 3 weeks later, Sundar sat across from Google's chief financial officer and 3 board members in a high-stakes quarterly review. On the large display behind them, red figures flickered ominously across projections for the next 2 quarters. It wasn't just a terminated contractor in Bangalore. 3 other vendor partnerships had voluntarily withdrawn, citing the new ethical oversight as overbearing and unrealistic. A few major shareholders were beginning to voice concerns behind the scenes. They were used to growth, not resistance. They expected steady numbers, not social revolutions. Sundar listened without interruption as the CFO broke down the implications. A potential 2.6% dip in projected margins, a negative ripple across 2 developing markets, and growing anxiety among the investor relations team. But Sundar didn't blink. He leaned forward, his elbows resting calmly on the sleek surface of the boardroom table. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice even. "What's the cost of trust?" The CFO looked slightly puzzled. "Trust?" "Yes," Sundar continued. "If our users, our engineers, our global community see us abandoning people who do the right thing just to protect quarterly gains, how long before they stop believing in who we are?" There was silence. He didn't rush to fill it. Instead, he let the stillness hang, allowing the weight of the question to press into the room. "This company was built on long bets," he added after a moment. "We don't just innovate in code, we lead in culture. If we let numbers override that, we're no different from the ones we just cut ties with." The board didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They respected him, and they feared losing the one thing more valuable than immediate returns: long-term credibility. The meeting ended without objection. But outside that glass-walled room, the tremors had begun. Sundar returned to his office. Late that night, where the world outside glittered under California's dusk, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, thinking, not about shareholders, or metrics, or optics. He thought of Arvind, now thriving, not because someone pulled strings, but because someone upheld a principle. He thought of his own father, who used to spend entire nights repairing radio circuits with soldering irons and bare hands so others could have music in the morning. Integrity was never convenient. It was only ever necessary, but not everyone shared that view. A few days later, an internal memo was leaked anonymously, but deliberately. It suggested that Sundar's interventions in external partnerships were distracting leadership from core innovation and placing social ethics above shareholder value. The language was clinical, impersonal, but it was loaded. Its timing was strategic. Just a week before Alphabet's annual general meeting, the leak reached media outlets within hours. Headlines spun variations of the same narrative. Is Google's CEO putting morality above business? And silence or strategy? Has Sundar Pichai gone too far? Sundar didn't respond. He issued no clarifying tweet, gave no interviews. He simply continued his day, walking the campus, speaking to engineers, reviewing project updates. But inside, something stirred, not anger, but clarity. He now understood that doing the right thing once wasn't enough. When you disrupted comfort, you didn't just upset villains, you unsettled the system that protected them. The Ethics and Equity Office, now working in over 10 countries, began encountering resistance. A partner company in Eastern Europe quietly paused a transparency audit. An internal hiring director challenged a new fairness policy. A renowned AI researcher, uncomfortable with the new review protocols, resigned and released a statement that danced on the edge of controversy. A group of female software developers formed an internal support initiative titled ECHO, short for Empowering Code, Honoring Others. It wasn't HRS sanctioned. It wasn't part of the diversity board. It simply grew organically young. Women mentoring one another, sharing stories, coding together, protecting one another's intellectual property, and supporting fair evaluations. The group credited its inspiration to Sundar's quiet restructuring, his choice to side with fairness even when it rattled senior leadership. Sundar caught wind of the group through a forwarded email chain. He didn't summon them to his office. He didn't record a promotional video. Instead, he sent them a personal note, typed by him late one night. Every time you echo each other's voices instead of competing to be the loudest, you are building a world worth inheriting. I'm listening, and so is the future. The note was framed on the wall of the Echo meeting room, but not everyone celebrated. In Silicon Valley's hyper-competitive echo chambers, Sundar's approach, slow, deliberate, values-driven, began to attract ridicule from a vocal faction of young tech elites who branded themselves disruptors. They called his style outdated. They mocked his refusal to clap back on social media. They dubbed him the Monk CEO. One influencer even posted a viral video titled, "Why Sundar Pichai's Silence is Killing Innovation." It trended for 3 days. But behind the mockery, something else was happening. Startups began quietly modeling their HR systems after Google's new fairness protocol. Internal ethics boards began popping up across smaller tech hubs. Venture capital firms requested guidance on conscious scaling from Google's legal teams. A quiet revolution had begun, not driven by drama, but by a belief that silence, when paired with strength, could rewrite the rules of power. And still, Sundar didn't seek the spotlight. He wasn't trying to win debates. He was trying to build an echo chamber of integrity so loud that even his silence could shake the foundations of hypocrisy. But as the reverberations of his choices reached global heights, a deeper, older test was approaching, one not rooted in technology or business or culture, but in something far more human. Because sometimes the loudest storms come not from outside forces, but from the past, and the past long buried under years of silence was about to knock on Sundar Pichai's door. The storm from the past. When silence meets memory, for all his foresight and discipline, Sundar Pichai was not immune to the forces of time. While he had skillfully navigated a maelstrom of modern injustice holding ground through boardroom politics, ethical disruptions, and cultural revolutions, he now found himself facing something far more elusive and far more personal. Memory. The kind that doesn't announce its arrival, but instead seeps quietly through the smallest cracks, often triggered by the most trivial of moments. And in Sundar's case, it began with a school invitation, a handwritten one, sent all the way from Chennai. It arrived on a Monday, pressed between envelopes of contracts and executive summaries. The front bore the insignia of his old high school, marked with a careful brush of ink. Inside, the message was simple yet powerful. The school was organizing a golden jubilee, and the principal had formally invited Sundar as the guest of honor. Not because he was a celebrity, but because he was, to them, a story of what dignity, perseverance, and humility could build over a lifetime. He didn't accept immediately. In fact, for 3 days, the invitation sat unopened on the edge of his desk, weighed down beneath a paperweight shaped like a transistor, a gift from his father many years ago. Finally, late one evening, long after most of the staff had left the Mountain View campus, Sundar leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and let his mind drift not to global problems or quarterly projections, but to the boy he used to be, the boy who walked barefoot to school in monsoon season, who memorized math tables in candlelight when the power would go out, who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. That boy didn't think he'd ever board an airplane, let alone lead a company that would chart the future of the digital world. And yet, even as a child, he had always known what silence meant. It wasn't fear. It was focus. And now that same silence whispered, "Go back." A month later, Sundar stood on the familiar soil of his school's cracked courtyard, the scent of jasmine and dust in the air, a hot sun overhead, and hundreds of young students sitting cross-legged before him. They were expecting a speech. Cameras had been arranged. The school board looked nervous but honored. A famous news outlet from Delhi had even sent a junior reporter to cover the event. But Sundar didn't bring notes. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled, and sandals, not for the image, but because he wanted to feel grounded. When he stepped up to the podium, the microphone buzzed faintly. The children looked up with awe, waiting for some grand declaration. But what they got was something else entirely. Sundar told them a story, not about success, not about Google, but about a classmate, Ravi, who once shared his only pencil with Sundar during an exam. He spoke about how Ravi, the son of a janitor, had been mocked for smelling of bleach, for wearing stitched-up uniforms, for sitting at the back of the room. Sundar had watched it all silent, helpless. He hadn't joined the bullies, but he hadn't stopped them either. And one day, Ravi stopped coming to school. "I still don't know where he is," Sundar said to the students, his voice steady but raw. "But I remember more than most of the people I met later in life." There was a pause. Sometimes silence is not strength. Sometimes it's cowardice. I learned that too late. The audience didn't clap right away, but a silence fell over them, a heavy, meaningful stillness that no round of applause could ever replicate. Sundar stepped down from the stage without waiting for cheers. He had said what he needed to say, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for the memory of a boy who had disappeared into obscurity, carrying nothing but the injustice of being unseen. That night, as Sundar sat alone in his childhood room, still preserved by his mother with the same bed, same cracked mirror, same rusty fan, he stared out the window and let the past pour in. The guilt he had never confessed. The words he had never said. He realized that while silence had often been his armor, there were times when it had been his prison too. But memory had a strange way of setting us free. 2 days after his speech, an email arrived from an anonymous sender. Subject: Ravi. The body of the email was short. "I saw your speech online. I remember that pencil too. I forgive you. That silence helped me find my voice. I became a teacher, Sundar. Not a CEO, but I teach boys like we were. And I teach them to speak." Sundar closed the laptop slowly, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to cry. Not in sadness, but in gratitude. Because silence had come full circle, not as a mistake, but as a seed that had grown in both of them. Differently, uniquely, but equally purposeful. But life, like leadership, rarely offers time to dwell. Back in California, a crisis was brewing. A whistleblower from a major East Asian supplier had just triggered a corporate landmine alleging labor violations, falsified records, and exploitation of underage workers in off-site facilities. The supplier was one of Google's oldest partners, deeply tied into multiple product lines. The legal team advised immediate containment. PR firms began drafting careful responses. The board asked for a low-profile resolution, but Sundar, freshly reminded of the past, knew what had to be done. He didn't respond with a press statement. He didn't attend the emergency summit. He flew directly to Taiwan, this time without Layla, without handlers, without fanfare. He entered the supplier's headquarters unannounced and requested only one thing: a visit to the off-site facility. They refused. He insisted. And when he was told it was impossible due to protocol, He made one phone call to Google's Global Procurement Division. His words were quiet but firm. Terminate all ongoing orders. Notify the compliance team. This contract is frozen until the truth is verified. The call lasted under 3 minutes. Within 12 hours, access was granted. The visit confirmed the worst. Underpaid minors, falsified age records, poor safety protocols. The images haunted Sundar, not just because of the suffering, but because of the echoes. Every child there reminded him of Ravi, of himself, of all the boys and girls who didn't have platforms or microphones or conference rooms. Back in Mountain View, Sundar made one final decision. He launched Project Lantern, a global fund dedicated to protecting vulnerable workers across Google's supply chain, not with charitable donations, but with binding policy. For every future contract, a clause would be added. Labor violations would result in immediate termination, full audits, and permanent blacklist status. No exceptions, no PR edits, no bailouts. And with it, a new internal motto quietly emerged, never printed on posters, never marketed, but passed quietly through emails, whispered between staffers, written on whiteboards. Silence is no longer enough. For Sundar, this wasn't a contradiction. It was evolution. He had used silence to resist noise, to protect truth, to challenge power. But now he understood its limits. Silence could be the first step. But voice measured, intentional, and rooted in memory was the next dot, and for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to speak. Not for himself, but for all the voices that had once been buried beneath the weight of silence. The voice of the future. When silence turns into legacy, time has a curious way of turning today's decisions into tomorrow's reflections. As Sundar Pichai sat on the rooftop garden of the Alphabet headquarters one quiet spring evening, overlooking a city painted gold by the setting sun, the wind carried not only the scent of blooming cherry blossoms, but also the invisible hum of progress lines of code being written, policies being drafted, lives being shaped. There were no cameras that evening, no speeches, no audience. Just him, a cup of tea in his hand, and the knowledge that silence, once his shield and his sword, had now become the legacy he would leave behind, not for glory, but for impact. Months had passed since the labor crisis in East Asia, since the memories of Ravi had risen from the depths of his past, and since he had chosen to stop outsourcing integrity to convenience. What began as a lone decision to dismantle quiet corruption had now grown into a culture that spoke in the language of fairness. Project Lantern, the global labor integrity initiative, had begun to yield visible changes both within Google and outside it. Supplier companies previously insulated by distance and dollar signs were now openly auditing themselves, issuing internal apologies, reforming practices, not for fear of exposure, but from a dawning realization. Sundar's quiet defiance had become a mirror for their own conscience. In boardrooms around the world, other CEOs, some of whom had once scoffed at Sundar's passive demeanor, were beginning to rethink what leadership looked like. They weren't seeking interviews or shouting ethics from stages. They were watching him, and in his restraint, they found resolve. In his pauses, they found purpose. And in his refusal to be rushed by trending topics, they saw the rebirth of a long-lost trait in leadership, wisdom. But change, Sundar had learned, was never final. It was not a summit to be reached, but a discipline to be lived. For every vendor that complied, another found loopholes. For every internal victory, there was a challenge disguised in bureaucracy. But the difference now wasn't in the obstacles, it was in the response. There were no more questions of whether ethics were worth the cost. There were only questions of how fast, how far, and how deeply the values could be applied. Inside Google's development teams, a new framework called Equity by Design had been rolled out, where every algorithm and user interface would be tested not only for efficiency, but also for fairness. Was it accessible to the disabled? Did it recognize cultural nuances? Was it inclusive of all genders, languages, socioeconomic realities? These weren't afterthoughts anymore. They were the baseline. And the idea hadn't come from a think tank. It had come from a late-night note Sundar once wrote to himself after watching a deaf user struggle to use an iVoice tool that wasn't trained on sign language-optimized commands. That note was found later in his journal by a young product intern who quoted it during a prototype demo. True innovation listens to the quietest voice in the room. That line became the unofficial slogan for the entire UX division. Elsewhere, the internal initiative Echo, started by young female engineers, had now blossomed into an entire mentorship infrastructure across Google's global campuses. Hundreds of women, and increasingly men, joined its weekly roundtables, not for HR compliance, but for real conversations. Conversations about work-life balance, imposter syndrome, bias and feedback cycles. And through these discussions, a new kind of culture was taking root, one where leadership wasn't determined by the volume of your voice, but by the integrity of your presence. It was in one of these sessions that Sundar quietly walked in unannounced. The room fell silent at first, unsure of how to respond. He didn't stand at the front. He didn't ask for the mic. He simply sat in a chair at the back, listened for an hour, took notes, and when asked if he wanted to say something, he smiled and said, "You've said it all. And I'm here because you shouldn't have to say it alone." But the true culmination of Sundar's quiet legacy arrived not in a press release or investor update, but in a letter. A physical one, much like the one he received from Meena All those months ago. It arrived on his desk in a simple brown envelope. No logo, no branding, just a return address, Chennai Government School for the Blind. Inside was a handwritten message in Braille. Alongside it, a typed translation. "Dear Sir, my name is Prabhu. I am 12 years old. I cannot see, but I can now hear your voice through Google's new screen reader for regional languages. My favorite feature is that it doesn't just read words, it lets me write back, so I am writing you now. Thank you for building something for someone like me. My teacher says you were once a quiet boy too. That makes me feel like I can become someone one day, even if I am quiet. Yours truly." Prabhu. Sundar held the letter for a long while, fingers gently brushing the raised dots of Braille, his heart impossibly full. Not because he was proud, but because he understood. This was it. Not the valuation, not the press, not even the applause of the public. But this letter, from a boy who couldn't see, but who felt seen, was the reason he had carried silence like a sacred stone all these years. Because silence, when carved with purpose, becomes the bridge between invisibility and dignity. That weekend, Sundar visited a local school in Mountain View. He didn't go to speak. He asked to observe a class using Google's new regional audio tools. As he stood quietly in the back, a young girl raised her hand and said to her teacher, "This tool is so cool. Who made it?" The teacher smiled and nodded toward Sundar, who stood quietly by the window. The girl looked over, tilted her head, and said innocently, "He doesn't look like the guy on YouTube with all the loud ideas." The class laughed. Sundar smiled. "Too. No," the teacher said gently. "He's the guy whose ideas are loud, even when he isn't." And that was enough. That evening, Sundar drafted a final message to his internal team, his last major address, before stepping away from day-to-day leadership into an advisory role. It wasn't long. It wasn't filled with numbers or performance metrics. It simply read, "We were told that silence is weakness. But silence is how we listen. It's how we watch. It's how we build. We must teach the world that the strongest voice does not always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it whispers. But when it speaks, it changes everything. Keep building. Keep listening. Sundar. And with that, the man who had once been mocked for being too quiet, too cautious, too calm, walked down the hallway of Alphabet Inc., not as the CEO, but as the architect of a quieter revolution. He left not with applause behind him, but with legacy walking beside him. Not a legacy of sound, but of resonance. The kind that doesn't just echo in corridors of power, but in the hearts of the forgotten dot, because in the end, Sundar Pichai didn't use silence to avoid the world. He used it to hear it better than anyone else. And in doing so, he made sure it could hear itself. The sound of stillness. When a legacy teaches the world to listen, legacies are not etched in monuments or carved into glass towers. They live quietly, tucked inside the decisions that outlast applause and the truths that remain long after the world has stopped watching. For Sundar Pichai, his departure from active leadership at Alphabet was not marked by spectacle or ceremony. There was no flashy farewell, no dramatic press conference. Instead, there was something far rarer, stillness. A stillness not of retreat, but of release. He did not leave because he had run out of strength. He left because the world had finally learned to carry what he had long been building: integrity in silence, impact without noise, and power without performance. The months following Sundar's transition to an advisory role revealed something remarkable. Google's core philosophy no longer relied on one man's restraint. It had matured into a culture where restraint had become reflex, where ethics were embedded in design, where decency was no longer optional. The programs he had seeded, Project Lantern, Echo, Equity by Design, were no longer experiments. They had become permanent infrastructures, maintained not for compliance, but for conscience. And within this ecosystem of quiet strength, a new generation of leaders began to emerge, not molded in the image of ego, but forged in the practice of humility. One of those voices belonged to Layla, the former human rights investigator turned director of the Ethics and Equity Office. With Sundar's mentorship behind her, she stepped forward not as his replacement, but as a new torchbearer. Her first decision in the new fiscal cycle was to expand Lantern's mandate, now offering ethics training and policy blueprints to smaller startups across Southeast Asia and Africa for free. Critics warned it would be unprofitable. Layla replied in her first all-hands meeting, "Profit doesn't measure what we prevent. It measures what we permit. And we no longer permit silence to excuse injustice." Meanwhile, in Chennai, the quiet revolution took on another form. At Sundar's childhood school, the same place where he had once watched his classmate Ravi vanish beneath the weight of poverty and silence, Abdias, new wing had been constructed with anonymous funding. The building bore no names, no dedications. Only a small plaque near the entrance read, "A place for voices that were once quiet." It became a center for public speaking, ethics in technology, and digital accessibility. Children from underprivileged backgrounds were taught not just how to use computers, but how to code with conscience, speak with truth, and lead with empathy. Volunteers from Google's Indian branches began to travel there, not to deliver lectures, but to listen to the next generation, to hear what needed building next. Sundar himself returned to the school only once after the wing opened. He arrived unannounced, wearing a simple kurta and sandals, and sat at the back of the ethics class. A teacher recognized him and hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge his presence. But Sundar shook his head gently and said, "Let the children keep speaking. I've had my turn." It was there, in that modest room painted in bright yellow and green, that a 10-year-old girl named Myler asked the most piercing question of the day. She had just finished presenting her project on fair technology use in rural villages and looked over at Sundar more out of curiosity than awe. "Sir," She asked plainly, "Is it true that you made Google listen?" The class went still. Sundar thought for a moment, then said, "No, I just stayed quiet long enough to hear the people it had never heard before." The children didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. But they would, one day. Because real legacy, Sundar knew, wasn't about being remembered. It was about making space for others to be seen. Back in the US, the media continued its cycle of trends and headlines. A new CEO made waves with charismatic interviews and bold initiatives. The world applauded fresh leadership styles, more animated, more outwardly engaging. But beneath the noise, Sundar's influence endured not in competition, but in contrast. While others chased the stage, he had built a platform. While others curated soundbites, he had cultivated systems. In Washington, during a closed-door session on global AI regulation, one of the senior senators paused during her prepared speech and turned to the new panel. "There was a man," she said slowly, "who never once told us what to fear. He only showed us what we'd already ignored." We didn't realize then that he was preparing us not for a moment, but for a mindset. Later, when asked who she meant, she smiled and said, "You won't find him trending. But you're living in the world he quietly made safer." As the years passed, Sundar's name began appearing less in headlines and more in acknowledgments inside ethics textbooks, leadership seminars, and startup playbooks. His silence had become not just a method, but a model. And in this echo of stillness, the world found something rare. Leadership that left without needing to be followed. Change that stayed without needing to be praised. And yet, despite the magnitude of what he had reshaped, Sundar's final years in public service were spent in the simplest of roles, advising youth programs, mentoring young women in tech, and occasionally walking the aisles of Google's cafeterias just to check in. He often sat with interns, asked them what they were working on, listened more than he spoke, and smiled when they shared bold ideas. He had become, in essence, the whisper behind the future. In one of his final journal entries, found after his quiet retirement, he had written something that perfectly summarized his life. "I once believed silence was merely the absence of noise. But now I know it is the presence of intention. I did not want to be the loudest voice in the room. I only wanted to make sure the room could hear everyone else." And that was how the world came to understand that leadership didn't need to dominate to define. Because in the story of Sundar Pichai, silence wasn't the absence of strength. It was its most enduring sound.